Hello, sports fans. Welcome to Cleats by Dre. I'm Dre, and I'm here to talk about sports. Today's episode is about MLB All-Star rosters, and more specifically about Francisco Lindor, the shortstop for the Mets, who did not make this year's team as of July 8th. Small point, Lindor should have been an All-Star. And the larger point here, the MLB All-Star Game could use all the marketable stars it could get. Should really think about emphasizing multi-year success more in its selections. Before we jump in, there's some biases, context, and caveats here. First of all, bias about me. I'm a lifelong Mets fan. I go back to the early 90s. Todd Hundley is my first favorite player. 1996, I fell in love with Lance Johnson and Bernard Gilkey and the stats they were putting up. I've also kind of lived through some really, really rough kind of free agent signings and moves, right? Mo Vaughn, the second coming of Jeremy Burnitz, Jed Lowry more recently. There's enough to mention. There's some hurt here and a little bit of bias, let's be honest. Contextually now, Lindor, he's actually had one of the biggest love-hate relationships I've seen. And love-hate, that's actually a good thing, right? Usually it's hate-hate. But love-hate in terms of the big contract he signed, Steve Cohen's first big signing, some mild success, a rough first year. We don't have to go too deep into it, but him and Javier Baez really giving the thumbs down to the fans. It's been rocky, but really the stats and what you see in the field too. A guy that says all the right things, a great leader on the field. Love-hate is a word that Mets fans have for Lindor. The caveat I'll give to this discussion is All-Star appearances are superficial. They're fairly meaningless. Fun to argue about. Don't mean too much, except really they do. When you think of a player's retirement announcement, you think of the Hall of Fame case. It gets mentioned the number of All-Stars that you've been to. And the All-Star Game is a big marketing vehicle for the MLB that we'll get into. So let's start with the stats and the case for Lindor this year as an All-Star. I'm going to get into advanced metrics a little bit. I'll try to explain it, right? So wins above replacement is a big stat. Basically think of if this player was replaced by the most mediocre player possible, a quadruple A type player. How many more wins based on advanced metrics, offense, defense, base running, is this player showing? Lindor, the first half of this year so far, wins above replacement of 3.5. That's really good. That's fifth highest in the National League among all players, not just shortstops. Counting stats, he has 25 doubles, 15 home runs, at least 15 stolen bases at the break. That's rarely been done. And he's playing league-leading defense. So a really solid first half of the year, even after a somewhat slow first couple of weeks in April. Now let's look at his competition for the position this year. And this is where it does get a little tricky. So at shortstop, Trey Turner from the Phillies is voted as a starter. He's been injured, but that's the fan vote, and good for the Phillies. They're having a great year. You can't quibble with it if the fans are going to vote. Mookie Betts took a backup spot. Incredible player, incredible first half. The players voted for him. Ellie De La Cruz, electric young player, right? WAR of 4.0 above Lindor's. The players voted him in. You can't argue with that. C.J. Abrams, the Nationals, a decent breakout year. His WAR of 2.3 does trail Lindor. It's almost entirely due to defensive metrics. But actually, he had to be the commissioner's pick on the reserves. The Nats not having anyone else that was deemed worthy. That's four shortstops right there. Where does Lindor fit? It's interesting. The other commissioner's pick, right? Because all stars are picked. Right, the fans pick the starters, the players get reserve picks, and the commissioner fills it in so everyone gets a player. One of the picks is actually Pete Alonso, another Met. Mets fans, we'll be the first to tell you we love Pete. Solid player. We want him back next year. Not exactly his best year so far, though, right? His WAR is 1.2. His slugging percentage is down. Solid player. We love him. Maybe not the most deserving, but what's interesting is his selection actually goes to my later point, my later thesis that is the commissioner looking for a marketable player, right? Do they want to get Alonso in the home run derby again? And so it's almost like you can't quibble too much with the selection if you're trying to grow the game at the end of the day. So really, I just went through the math. It's tough to fit Lindor in this team. So when I say he should have been an all-star, I'm looking at previous years, right? So this is the third straight year Lindor's been in this spot. Now, he's a notorious slow starter in his career, and we'll get into his stats a little bit on that. But let's look at his last few years, and we'll just focus on the hitting stats here for simplicity purposes. So I'm going to introduce another stat. Here's they call it WRC plus, weighted runs created plus. Just think of this as a way to take all the different things a player does to create runs, and there's a scale that it's ran against the rest of the league that year, right? This helps account for live ball errors, dead ball errors. It really helps us compare over time. In 2022, 2 years ago, Lindor's first half weighted runs created plus was 116. The average is 100, so think of that. He's 16% better than a typical player. The Mets were really good in 2022. They had lots of all-stars. Marte, Alonso, McNeil, Diaz. Lindor is still deserting. And an infielder like Jake Cronenworth from the Padres makes the team in one of his really first good years. The second half of the year, Lindor's weighted runs created plus goes up to 138. He finished 9th in NL MVP voting that year. Now, 2023, similar situation. His first half weighted runs created plus is 119. The Mets stunk. Really disappointing year. Geraldo Perdomo of the D-backs makes the All-Star team ahead of him. Who is that? Lindor goes on in the second half to have a weighted runs created plus of 126. He ends up in the 30-30 club with great defense. Again, 9th in NL MVP voting on a very mediocre Mets team. Perdoma's second half weighted runs created plus goes down to 75. He can't hit anymore. There's this theme here of the first half wonders that we'll get to more. So, Lindor has a career weighted runs created plus of 125 in the second half of his seasons and 114 in the first half of the seasons in his career. So if you think of it, at 125, that's Hanley Ramirez. That's Nomar. He's that good. This is his offense in the second half of the year. The first half of the year, over his 8+ year career, he's Gleyber Torres. We're not even talking about his defense, but that's quite a big difference. He's a second half of the year player. So this is now, what makes this tricky is the All-Star Game, right? It happens in the middle of the year. There's this half-year definition that makes it tough. In the National League this year, there's actually a dearth of options in the outfield. It's stacked at short. So maybe you could see, hey, all right, maybe Lindor doesn't fit this year. But with hindsight of 2020, he absolutely should have been in there. 2023, 2022, if you were just to look back and ask your question, who were the best players in MLB that year? In history, if you're looking back at that. Which really leads me to my main and final point. The MLB All-Star Game. It's a premium marketing vehicle for a sport that's dying for attention. In danger of irrelevancy. Keep the All-Star Game in the summer, right? All the other leagues are not going on. It's the one time that it can shine. But it doesn't mean the selection system has to set up to only look at the first half performance of that season, especially because baseball, notorious for the influences of luck, right? Sample sizes can be fool's gold. A few months of playing well gives a guy an all-star slot, and then we never even hear from him again. So what's at risk here, this midsummer game, right? This one big, outside of the World Series, and maybe even more so, opportunity to market these players, you get an unrecognizable group of faces that don't matter in the annals and history of the game. So let's look at other leagues just for a second, right? So the NBA, right? The NBA, I looked at the last 3 years. 21% of their all-stars are first-timers. The NFL, and keep in mind the Pro Bowl is at the end of the year. So you actually have a full year for first-timers to prove their worth. 31%. MLB's number is 47%. 47% of all the all-stars in the last 3 years were first-timers in that year. That's half. That is a lot. And by the way, I didn't do NHL. You will quickly realize I have a few lanes here that I'll stick with. So if you think about those numbers I just shared, right? 21% NBA, 31% NFL, 47% MLB. You know the NBA stars. You could rattle them off. They're going to be in the game year after year. In the NFL, you don't really know most of them, but they still show greater consistency in recognizing who's great year in and year out. What is going on with the MLB? Too many half-year wonders get this All-Star nod. And honestly, I'm not even here to talk about the other Met, Brandon Nimmo, who didn't make it over Heliot Ramos, 320 career at-bats for Ramos, and a 370 batting average on balls in play. Another advanced stat I know. 370 is really high. It could get to be a luck factor there, and I don't want to knock other players too much. I'm sure his team's fans will come and say really great things about him, but there's a risk here of not having your multi-year stars, right? The guys that have earned the big contracts that are still producing, getting left out of this key marketing vehicle. So my suggestion, right? If nothing else, commissioner's office, be daring with how we pick the All-Star teams. Be innovative. Change the formula a bit. Keep the fans picking the starters. Maybe take prior year's votes into account. Is that possible? How do we make this a multi-year decision instead of just, that one fan base that's really ramped up this year? Take a couple spots away from the players' votes. Make sure you have more wiggle room to pick up a multi-year kind of star. Or at least when the commissioner's office, you get a chance to make the pick. You value the multi-year pedigree more, right? You want to pick guys that people can look back on and be like, yeah, I remember that All-Star game. Yeah, I remember Francisco Lindor and the big smile and having fun out there and, on his way to a Hall of Fame career. So my biggest point is let's get to know our baseball stars again and let's get to know them in the All-Star game. All right. Thanks for tuning in.